One thing I hadn't thought about as I read it is you observe the way the definition of morality shifts after
Yeah.
World War II and the Holocaust. Can you say a little bit more about that? How does Hitler become this new standard of morality?
Yeah, so I got to credit a British scholar, Alec Ryrie, for this observation. And he wrote a little book that I found tremendously helpful and challenging in my faith. It's called Unbelief, A History of Doubt. And he made this observation that I just had not fathomed before. In my leadership at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, we look very closely at what are the contributing factors to widespread dechurching and what can the church do to reverse those trends. But he had used an argument from World War II in particular to argue of this, Copernican shift in morality starting in Europe, but spreading across the West, where you have the most resonant figure in Western history being Jesus Christ. Our very calendars, obviously, are turning on his birth. But then, the standard then for all this time is how can you live up to, but ultimately fall short of Jesus? So the problem is essentially how can anybody live up to God's standards? But with Hitler, that clearly begins to shift, and he occupies a kind of place in history that is analogous to few people in terms of the influence that he had. Of course, a pernicious influence, the opposite of Jesus. But the influence that brings about this revolution is that now no longer do people say, I'm trying to live up to the standard of Jesus, but now people are saying, I'm okay because I'm simply not as bad as Hitler.
Hmm.
And in fact, Kendra, I was just reading a book on moral questions related to World War II, and as I do, and one of the
Totally
things,
normal.
a totally normal thing for people to stay up late into the night doing all the time. But one of the questions that was raised in that book that I just not thought about before was that in Allied propaganda, United States and Great Britain in particular, Germany and Japan were treated very differently. When people were wanting to personify evil for the Nazi regime, it was Hitler. But that was not done in the same way. There were prominent leaders in Japan, like Hirohito, the emperor, Tojo, the prime minister. But when people would turn to Japanese evil, they would look at the entire Japanese people as a
Hmm.
race. But it was personified in Germany by Hitler. So I think that helps to contribute to our way of coping with the unspeakable trauma of everything that happened in World War II as saying this is a kind of aberration because of this one person. And there's another factor just to get into a little bit of historical political nuance and complexity on this one. There was an overwhelming need to reintegrate the German people into the Allied cause because of the Cold War. So
Sure.
there's a pretty quick turn. If you can say, well, Hitler is uniquely bad, then all of a sudden the German people, they're not really at fault for what happened. And we were trying to kill them a few minutes ago, but now they're among our best friends. So that's one of the ways that Hitler became, where that moral revolution happened, where now, and I don't know if you see this, Kendra, but this put words to something I've heard a lot, which is people saying, I'm good. Well, why should you go to heaven? Not as bad as Hitler. I think
Right.
that's the most common response that I've gotten to that question for decades.